Hey, how's it going? It's well established that I love futuristic space mega projects, and space elevators are probably the most well-known of all the space megastructure ideas. If you haven't heard of a space elevator before, the idea is pretty simple. In fact, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's an elevator that goes to space. Sounds a little fantastical, and yeah, but from a physics perspective, it is theoretically possible to build, at least if we can figure out how to manufacture a metric ton of carbon nanotubes. Beyond that, it's essentially just an engineering problem to figure out how you actually assemble one and how you get enough funding for it and how you stop a bunch of sexless joy singularities from petitioning the council to not build it because it's ruining their view of the series of discarded first-stage rocket boosters outside the back of their house. The idea of a space elevator has turned up lots of times in different sci-fi franchises. There's a bunch of them in the Halo franchise, there was that one in Foundation that killed a few billion people, but my favourite one in fiction is the space elevator from Ace Combat 7. Now, despite how good the graphics are, the Ace Combat games are actually pretty arcadey. They're not that realistic. The games take place in a universe where fighter jets apparently cost about as much as a Honda Civic, seen as it's considered a suitable punishment for prison convicts to give them an F-22 and make them participate in some Top Gun type shenanigans, but let's stay on track. My question for today is, how realistic is the space elevator design from Ace Combat 7? Let's talk about it. Yeah, smart move to wait until Ace Combat 8 gets announced to make a video about space elevators so you can do a tie-in. Actually, I just happened to have been doing a playthrough of Ace Combat 7 last week, and I realized that I couldn't go one more week of my life without talking about my favorite Ace Combat character, so it gave me an excuse to do this video. Your favorite Ace Combat character? Who's that? Nagase? No. Smash! But no. Mihai? Also Smash! But no. Listen, there's only one character who's truly inspired a generation. The one, the only. Princess Rosa's dog! Look at him! Check him out! He's so good! He's a still image, he doesn't move, he doesn't give a fuck! Worldwide military conflict? No, he's too busy standing there, stoic, unbothered, a glorious bastion of fucks ungiven. Look at him. Plot-related dialogue? Fuck that. Time to be a JPEG. Oh, the game director says it's actually a video of the dog and the dog just happened to have stood still. Lies. He's JPEG dog. MP4 dog doesn't have the same ring to it. Zan, I think you're rather losing the people who came here to learn about space elevators. Alright, yeah, so a space elevator is basically a tether that stretches from the surface of the Earth all the way up to a counterweight in orbit. Let's try and picture this properly. Imagine launching a satellite into geostationary orbit. That's where you're in an equatorial orbit, so you're rotating around the planet at the equator, and you're also rotating around the planet at the same rate that the planet itself is spinning. In other words, if you're stood on Earth and you're looking at the satellite up in the sky, it looks like it's staying in exactly the same place over time. Now, imagine this satellite lowers a cable towards the planet until it touches the surface. You anchor that cable to the ground and then you get a lift and travel up the cable. Hey presto, that's a space elevator. But there are some problems with that design. You might notice that as soon as you start going up that cable, you're going to be tensioning that cable, which applies a force to the satellite at the top and causes it to come crashing down onto an orphanage or whatever. So to keep the system passively stable, you actually want to open out two cables from that geostationary satellite, one going down, but one going up. The velocity needed to orbit a planet and stay in a circular orbit changes depending on what altitude you're at. And the only part of the space elevator that should be able to be in orbit, strictly speaking, is the part of it in geostationary orbit, right? Like if there's a big line spinning at this sort of uniform RPM around the Earth once per day, those lower parts are actually not going to be going fast enough to be, strictly speaking, in orbit, and those higher up, further away parts that are beyond geostationary orbit are actually going to be quote-unquote orbiting too fast to be in orbit, strictly speaking. To help imagine what I mean, if you were to hypothetically cut this cable into sections, like, you know, you just imagine that the cable gets Thanos snapped and turns into a bunch of individual particles that aren't in contact with each other. The lower ones wouldn't be going fast enough to stay in a circular orbit, so their orbits would decay relative to what the cable would have been doing, and those outer particles would have been going too fast, so some of them will be going fast enough to actually achieve Earth escape velocity, or even faster. Some of those particles might actually end up in a transfer orbit and go to other planets in the star system, and that's actually the good part about a space elevator, but I'll get back to that in a second. Okay, so if you join up those particles again and imagine this cable as a continuous object, it wouldn't want to stay straight and do what you want it to do. It would actually probably want to kind of coil weirdly around the Earth over time. You stop that from happening by basically hanging a really heavy object off the end of the cable. Typically, people imagine very carefully nudging an asteroid from the asteroid belt towards the Earth, and then I guess you'd park that asteroid in geostationary orbit right next to your satellite when it still has the cables rolled up inside of it, and then you'd attach the asteroid to the end of the cable, and then you'd move the asteroid slowly outwards into a higher orbit as you lower the floor cable down and anchor it to the Earth. Once the whole thing's set up, this would actually keep the cable in tension, and tension is the key to making it work. You want this whole system to work like a person spinning around in a circle with a heavy object on the end of a string. The person is the Earth, the string is the space elevator, and the heavy object is the asteroid or whatever counterweight you want to use. Asteroids just make a lot of sense because there's already asteroids in space weighing the requisite thousands or millions of tons, and it's going to be impractical to launch that amount of mass from the Earth just to act as a counterweight anyway, so you might as well just use the matter that's in space already to do that. If you can keep the overall center of mass of the entire space elevator above the geostationary level, you should be able to keep the entire system in tension, which is good because that means it's going to stay straight and it's not going to fall down. Of course, once you have this thing assembled, you're then free to construct various space stations at different points along the elevator. The most obvious place for which is at the counterweight, where you can just dig all the stuff out of the asteroid that you're using and make a big space station out of it. But also, the idea is to make the space elevator literally like 100,000 kilometers long, meaning it goes way beyond the roughly 36,000 kilometer altitude of geostationary orbit. Once you go beyond the geostationary point, the overall forces are going to be pointing away from the planet, not towards it. Like you're being spun around the Earth, that centrifugal force pointing outwards will be dominant over the Earth's gravity pointing inwards. So you're going to naturally want to fly off into deep space, and you're going to want to do that more and more the further out on the cable you are. Probably the actual use case for this is you want to go to just the right part of the cable that you want to be at, somewhere on the outer end beyond the geostationary point, and then you can just let go of the cable and fly off into deep space without having to expend any fuel. Now, depending on where you want to go in the solar system, you can fine-tune where you are on the cable and the moment that you let go. So I imagine you'd want to build various stations along the different altitudes of the cable, as though they're like a harbor filled with spaceships all going to Mars or all going to Jupiter or whatever, just depending on where they are on the cable. Now, the biggest problem with building one of these is the material strength needed. There's no material that we can currently mass manufacture that's capable of creating cables which would put up with the tensile stresses involved in building something like this, although carbon nanotubes definitely could work. We just can't manufacture them in gigantic quantities right now. Funnily enough though, any planet with some rotation will be able to have a space elevator, and depending on the spin rate and the gravity, certain planets will be easier or harder to make space elevators work for. The Moon, for example, would need to have a longer space elevator than the Earth would, but even though the space elevator there would be larger, the forces involved would be smaller, so we could potentially make a space elevator on the Moon out of standard materials like steel or whatever. In all honesty, the Moon would probably be a more useful place to have a space elevator, but whatever, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, that's the general idea behind a space elevator. Space elevators are arguably the entry-level space megastructure. Like, you could get more mass to orbit using a launch loop or an orbital ring or something like that, but those need constant power input just to maintain their existence, whereas a space elevator is kind of passive once you set it up. Anyway, now we've laid the groundwork, we can talk about the space elevator designing Ace Combat 7, but first things first, if you really want to design a space megastructure, you're going to need some serious science, maths, and computer skills, which is why this episode is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is an online learning platform that helps you excel in science, maths, computer programming, technology, and more. You learn through active problem solving, a method that research has shown to be far more powerful than just watching lectures or videos. You can start learning at a level that's right for you, and practice sets and reviews are personalized so you can advance at your own pace. I have personally been wanting to learn how to code for years, and it's something that I've tried to learn and then just bounced off of several times, but I've been doing the Thinking in Python course with Brilliant, and wow, this has been vastly more fun and more effective than any other approach I've ever taken. It's honestly really good. I'd be saying that even if this wasn't a sponsor. Like, I really genuinely recommend using Brilliant. In fact, Brilliant literally doubled the size of their content library in 2025, so their catalog is huge at this point. So they're basically guaranteed to cover something that you want to learn. And whilst they do have a course called How AI Works, you can be assured that everything on Brilliant is handcrafted by humans, expert humans, deliciously intelligent expert humans. So if you want to learn for free on Brilliant for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/Xandros, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description. Brilliant's also given my viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to absolutely everything on Brilliant. So go over there and check them out with my link so they know who sent you, or I am going to come over to your house and do this.
Help! Please! Someone! I'm going to die!
Alright, thanks. Back to the video. Alright, this is the real juicy part. Ace Combat 7. The space elevator in the game is absolutely beautiful architecturally. God damn. It's out in the ocean next to a city. It's got this flared base to stop the... That can't go in the video. It's got this flared sort of petal-based structure for stability, and that base alone is really quite unsettlingly tall. It's kind of hard to appreciate just how big this thing is when you're buzzing by it in an F-15, but it really is huge. It's actually quite reminiscent of the Exceed 4000. I know that sounds like some horrific fetish machine, but it's actually a proposed 4-kilometer high tower that could house up to 1 million people if it were ever actually built. I think there's quite clearly been some design inspiration here. This shape would be very good for keeping things stable, and if you make it out of reinforced concrete, it probably is a sensible design for anchoring a huge tensile load to the ground. So yeah, I think this all checks out. The space elevator is constructed on a series of artificial islands with a comedically long bridge going out to it. Also, there's an undersea tunnel going out to it because of course there is. It's an Ace Combat game. There's got to be something ridiculous for you you to fly through in the last level while acquiescing some Latin bullshit to make it feel like you're fighting God himself. You know, it's interesting to consider whether having a space elevator placed far away from people is realistic. Like, would you want to distance it away from an urban area? Like, the Ace Combat setup contrasts against the way that space elevators are presented in Halo, for example, where obviously they're more prevalent because it's further in the future, but they do seem to be just kind of peppered around urban environments a lot. Honestly, it's hard to say whether you'd want to keep these distant from inhabited areas. Like, the closer they are, the more convenient they are, right? It's like having a subway station to space next to your house. But also, distancing a space elevator from places where people live makes things safer in the event that something falls or drops off of one of the cars riding up and down on the cables. Then again, I don't really think that's particularly likely to happen, and certainly not regularly. I don't think it's particularly likely to make a huge amount of noise either. I guess it'll probably have power generators and stuff, so yeah, maybe. People often wonder what would happen if a failure occurs and the cable snaps. The cables are probably only centimeters thick, particularly at ground level, so they aren't really going to do something like what happened in Foundation where it kills ridiculous amounts of people. In fact, if the failure happens anywhere within the Earth's atmosphere, the tension on the counterweight will get released and the cable will actually fly upwards, which is kind of weird to think about. Anyway, overall, this design gets really high marks from me. The major difficulty with making a space elevator look and behave realistically probably comes with how the space parts are depicted, since those are the bits with all the weird, unintuitive physics going on and therefore most prone to being depicted in a way which is completely bonkers, and the descriptions we get are vague enough that there's kind of nothing to be wrong about it. I guess the one note that I would give about what we do see is the depiction of a space elevator that's non-movable. I have seen some versions of space elevator designs being attached to something like an oil rig that can be moved if there's a really bad storm coming. Now, you don't get any hurricanes directly along the equator, which is where this would need to be, and where the one from Ace Combat is correctly located canonically as well. That's another good point. That's another big thumbs up. But you would get storms bad enough that it would be better to move the space elevator if you want to continue using it. Moving only a couple of dozen miles on the Earth would be a small enough amount of movement in the grand scheme of things that you wouldn't need to like move the counterweight at the top or anything. So this idea could potentially work, but then again, the one in Ace Combat does have these baffles along the side, which do at least have a passing resemblance to the trilateral symmetry of the design of the Burj Khalifa and the Jeddah Tower, which is meant to prevent wind loads from building up on one side of the building and collapsing it. And there is an instance where these are actually referred to as windbreaks in the game. So maybe this depiction of a space elevator is literally just beefy enough that it straight up doesn't need to run away from the bad weather. So all in, this is a pretty sweet depiction of a space elevator. I give it 1 thumbs up out of 1 and my own personal hooray! Can't wait to see how long this thing would realistically work when there's several hundred fighter jets dogfighting in the immediate vicinity of it, but whatever. As always, thanks to all my elite level supporters, Thunderbolt22810, who built a space escalator, not elevator, escalator. Nomad Greg, who flew an F-14 on full afterburner over Disneyland and traumatized a bunch of children. Andrew Mall, who doesn't have a space elevator, but he has a pretty big beanstalk, which is functionally a space elevator so long as you don't mind climbing it and getting walloped by all the giants he's got living up there. John Bejarano, who can pogo stick high enough that he has no need for a space elevator. JDK, who built a space elevator, as in an elevator that only works when there's nothing but empty space inside of it. Mutantious Doom, who knows there's no space elevators in real life, but he did once climb to the top of Mount Everest, meaning he briefly had the highest nipples on the planet. Stormester Ritter, who smiles like a Boeing X-32. Google it, you'll see what I mean. Nikita Lurie, who fell out of a space elevator and against all odds ended up flying right into a patch of ground where I like to bury all my evidence. Aaron Rowe, who lives at the top of a space elevator just for the fun of emptying the septic tank once a day. And thanks to all my other supporters too. Don't forget to join the Patreon or the channel membership if you want to be featured in my video credits or chat on Discord. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.